If I were to ask you to name a psychopath, maybe you'd reach for the serial killer Ivan Milat or the Hannibal Lecter character in Silence of the Lambs. But research shows most psychopaths just live amongst us, frequently as charming, productive members of society, albeit cunning and manipulative ones. In fact, the same research shows that chief executives are apparently 4 times more likely than average to be psychopathic. The British author Jon Ronson has recently been looking at psychopaths for his latest book, The Psychopath Test. You might know him from his earlier book, The Men Who Stare at Goats, which became a film starring George Clooney. Jon Ronson's speaking at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas at the Sydney Opera House this weekend, and we met earlier today. I asked him how psychopathy became a diagnosable condition.
It was a guy called Robert Hare, Canadian psychologist, who was working as a prison psychologist, and basically he said psychopaths would just make his life hell all the time. They'd cut the brake cables of his car, and so he was thinking, okay, he wanted to make his life's work to basically, you can't cure them, you can't treat them, so what's the best thing you could do is root them out. So he came up with this 20-point checklist.
Based on the psychopaths he'd had involvement with?
Yeah, basically. I mean, at first he was experimenting on them. He'd strap them up to, electricity generators. And he'd say, I'm going to count backwards from 10 to 1, and at 1 you're going to get a really big electric shock. And he'd noticed that the psychopaths would hardly break a sweat. The non-psychopaths would, as the countdown was going on, but the psychopaths kind of nothing. But then the electric shocks got banned, and so we had to come up with more cunning ways of spotting psychopaths. So we came up with this checklist, and it's things like grandiose sense of self-worth, glibness, superficial charm, lack of remorse, lack of empathy, juvenile delinquency, and so on. 20 of them, and it's become like a standard now. If you've been convicted of a crime and you're in the sentencing hearing, and they bring in a psychopath expert, and the psychopath expert says, "Yeah, this guy's got 15 out of the 20." You're kind of screwed. You can end up in jail for way longer than you would have been if you scored less on the checklist.
So, I mean, it sounds pretty subjective, because one person's assessment of someone displaying grandiose self-worth may not be somebody else's.
Yeah, and this is the problem. Psychopaths definitely exist, and I've met enough of them now to know that they are kind of different to non-psychopaths. There's something kind of, a bit creepy and absent and about them. However, you're right, it's unbelievably subjective. And, when I became an adept psychopath spotter, I instantly went power crazed. I started spotting psychopaths everywhere. And you know what? It's not just me. An awful lot of court experts who go around with the checklist are just as power crazed as I became.
So how quickly can you spot a psychopath?
Kind of instantly.
So am I a psychopath?
Well, when I say instantly, no, you like me, you've got too much anxiety.
No, but see, the fact that I even asked that's very narcissistic, so it shows a grandiose sense of self-worth.
But are you worried that you might be a psychopath? Because that means you're not. Anyone who's worried means that they're not. When I say instantly, in all seriousness, if I sit down with somebody for half an hour and I kind of get them off their guard, I reckon after half an hour I can spot. There's certain tricks. They hate weakness. They got no empathy. I asked a lot of people I suspected might be psychopaths, do you consider empathy to be a kind of weakness? And because they hate being thought of as weak, that's sometimes when they'll say, yeah, empathy's a weakness, and that's a big clue.
One of the people that you met to assess whether they were a psychopath or not was Al Chainsaw Dunlap, who Australians might remember because he worked for Kerry Packer in the late 80s and early 90s. Tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, Chainsaw Al. Basically, Robert Hare said, the really big story here is corporate psychopathy. It's so powerful, it's remoulded society all wrong. He said, you should try and find yourself some corporate psychopaths. So I wrote to Chainsaw Al Dunlap. He was a ruthless asset stripper in the 90s. You're right, he worked for Kerry Packer over here, and then he went to America, and basically a huge failing company would bring in Chainsaw Al because he was kind of ruthless. He would close down factories and not feel bad about it,
Sort of liked it, in fact.
Yeah, in fact, he'd sometimes fire people with a bit of a joke. Somebody said to him one time, I've just bought myself a new car. And he said, well, you may have a new car, but I'll tell you what you don't have, a job.
Boom tish.
Yeah, you're fired. And so, he'd turn small towns into ghost towns, and every time he'd do that, the share price would skyrocket. So, the shareholders were winning at the expense of the workers, and of course, a CEO who rather enjoys firing people and certainly has no remorse about it, is a valuable asset. So I wrote to Al Dunlap, not mentioning psychopath in my email, saying you might have a special brain quality that makes you special. Can I come and interview you? He said, come over, which I guess is slightly cunning manipulative. So I went to his house, which was filled with statues of predatory animals. It was like Narnia, like stone lions and tigers, like, kind of like the savannah turned to stone. So I went through the psychopath checklist with him, and he basically redefined many of the items on the psychopath checklist as business positives.
So give me an example.
OK, grandiose sense of self-worth, which, by the way, would have been hard for him to deny because he was standing underneath a giant oil painting of himself. He said, well, you've got to believe in you. I said, shallow affect and inability to experience a range of emotions. Who wants to be weighed down with some nonsense emotions? He kind of turned the hair checklist into who moved my cheese.
And so when did you make him aware that you were evaluating to see whether he was a psychopath?
Well, early on, because, I felt I had to. So I said to him, how I said in my email that you may have a special brain quality?
Guess what?
Yeah, I said, well... He was with his wife and bodyguard at the time. They were in the kitchen. So they all. I said, some psychologists would say that makes you. He said, what? And finally, I said the word loud enough for him to hear. And he looked very disappointed. And I said, well, I've got a checklist in my pocket. And as soon as I, got onto the checklist, he got kind of intrigued.
Another case you write about in the book is the case of a guy called Tony who has basically faked that he is mentally ill and then ends up in a mental institution instead of a prison. Mm. Is it harder to convince people that you are insane than sane?
It's much, much harder to convince somebody you're sane than it is convincing you're insane once you're inside the system. Tony basically beat a guy up when he was 17, beat a guy up in Reading, a little town outside London, decided to fake madness because he thought it would be cushier than, he had this kind of vision of having a PlayStation in one hand and a pizza in the other in some cushy hospital. But he faked madness much too well and ended up in Broadmoor, which is, Britain's most notorious high security mental hospital, and is stuck. If he'd just gone to jail for GBH, he'd have done 5 years, and he's been in Broadmoor. He was in Broadmoor for 14 years. He said, it's really, really hard to convince people. Once they think you're mentally ill, because they believed him, it's really hard to convince them you're sane.
I love the anecdote with him where he says that he thought the way to convince people that you're sane is to just talk about normal things. And so he says to this nurse, he's been reading New Scientist, and he says, do you know that the US military is trying to train bees how to sniff out explosives? And then next thing he sees his medical chart and it's been written up, thinks bees can sniff out explosives.
Believes bees. Poor guy. When he told me that, I thought, thank God I didn't meet any psychiatrists when I was writing The Many Staring Goats, because I'd have said, the US Army think they can kill goats just by staring at them, believes.
Yeah, exactly. But the mere fact that Tony faked that he was crazy indicated that perhaps he was a psychopath.
Yeah, exactly. They decided after a while that, he did fake madness to get out of a prison sentence because his delusions were very kind of cliched, and the minute he got to Broadmoor, he realised he'd made a really big mistake. They all vanished. But they decided that, what he is a psychopath. And in fact, faking madness is exactly the kind of cunning, manipulative act of a psychopath. So faking your brain going wrong is evidence that your brain has gone wrong.
Jon Ronson, thank you very much.
Thanks, Lee.
And the full Jon Ronson interview will be available on our website.